without no much more further ado, I would like to invite Professor Biodun Jeyifo to give his lecture. Professor Jeyifo.
Mr. Chairman, all protocols duly observed, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to at last be able to give this lecture. I say this because first, I was to have given the lecture last year but could not do so for all sorts of reasons. And second, because this year once again, other pressing engagements and commitments almost made it impossible for me to give the lecture. I say almost because in the end I was able to make it, and for this I am deeply gratified. I don't know if the amplification is loud enough. I myself. Hello? There is another reason why I am very delighted to be giving this lecture, and this is simply the fact that the sponsors of the lecture, the Wole Soyinka Center for Investigative Journalism, is an organization whose work and vision I both greatly admire and endorse. Journalism, specifically activist journalism, was crucial in the struggle for our country's freedom from colonial rule, just as we are finding out more and more that in the long and unfolding struggles to consolidate that independence from continued foreign domination and internal misrule, anarchy, and suffering for the vast majority of our peoples, that tradition of journalism will prove indispensable. As a matter of fact, I make bold to say that at no time in the course of our pre-independence and post-independence history has there been a greater need for a free and vibrant press than the present historical moment. The Wole Soyinka Center for Investigative Journalism is a leading, perhaps pioneering organization for the consummation and perpetuation of this vital tradition of the press at this particular conjunctural moment in our history. May its work live up to the great expectations that its mission bestows on its founding in the years and decades ahead. All modern democratic nations and societies need a free press, at the center of which stands the kind of activist, professionally mature investigative journalism that the WCAIJ seeks to nurture and expand in our country. Beyond this, the developing nations of Africa and other parts of the global south have an even greater need for a free press, for an activist, independent-minded journalism than the affluent liberal democracies of the global north. The theme of my lecture this morning, the Freedom of Information Act of 2011, as it confronts the immense challenge of what I call the dictatorship of corruption and mediocrity, is a very small part of this global issue of the centrality of a free press and an independent-minded journalism for all modern democratic societies. But this should not blind us, this smallness should not blind us to the immensity of its ramifications for the survival of our country and the future prospects of the majority of our people. Since the term dictatorship of corruption and mediocrity, the title of my talk, goes to the heart of this assertion, let me now dispel any puzzlement concerning the term by directly addressing the range of issues and significations I have in mind in my use of it. But before going directly to this theme, a word of clarification is perhaps necessary. As I move into discussion of the theme, I ask you, my audience, to bear in mind that the question that drives all my observations, analysis, and projections is this: what need do we have for a Freedom of Information Act when what I am calling the dictatorship of corruption and mediocrity in our country is so open about all the corrupt misdeeds, all the inept illegalities, and all the official inanities that attach to democratic governance in our country? Let me put this even more concretely. What do you need a Freedom of Information Act for when official corruption, official banditry operates in our country, not in secrecy, but in plain view, leaving all the marks of its operations everywhere? Well, my answer to this question is that we still need that landmark legislation that is known as the Freedom of Information Act that was passed in the year 2011, even if corruption and the mediocrity which it creates on a vast scale in our country are normatively not hidden, not shrouded in secrecy. As a matter of fact, I shall in the course of my lecture be arguing that there is a crisis of underutilization of the Freedom of Information Act by our press, by our media houses, in spite of the fact that they were at the forefront of the struggle, of the long struggle for the passing of the act. Indeed, my central argument in the lecture will be that though the nature and scale of corruption in Nigeria poses a challenge to the Freedom of Information Act, this is a challenge that is not insurmountable. Before I come to this argument, it is perhaps helpful to highlight three particular cases that are exemplary in their graphic illustration of the climate of corruption that the FOI must contend with in our country, that is almost without comparison with the moral and political climates that the Freedom of Information Act in other countries of the world have to deal with. And here, I say parenthetically, let me note here that the Freedom of Information Act exists in many countries of the world. It has indeed become an almost indispensable part of human and civil rights legislation in many parts of the world. Now, the first case concerns perhaps the biggest and the most brazen act of state or official corruption ever perpetrated in Nigeria itself, or perhaps in any other country in the world for that matter. This sublime brigandage is known as the oil subsidy scam of 2011. It involved vast sums of money paid out of our national coffers to a cabal of oil marketers that holds the lifeline to the distribution of petroleum products in our country. I am sure that every woman and man in this hall has heard or read of this case before, but all the same, a critical look at the details is worth going over in the context of this lecture. For the avoidance of doubt or confusion, let us remember that in the Nigerian context, oil subsidy implies an annual budgetary allocation to defray the cost of refined oil imported into the country to augment the shortfall between what our oil refineries produce and the volume of petroleum products that the nation consumes annually. There is a long-standing controversy concerning the reality and the scale of this subsidy, but in the present context, we need not concern ourselves with that controversy. The important thing to note here is that in the year 2011, and depending on which set of posted and announced figures you use for your computation, what was actually paid out to marketers as oil subsidy was 6 to 9 times bigger than what was budgeted, even though there was no rise at all in the volume of petroleum products sold and consumed in the country. Specifically, in the 5 years before 2011, the average annual sum paid out for oil subsidy by the federal government had been around 400 billion naira. Indeed, for 2011, the posted budgeted sum was 245 billion naira for the whole year. But within the first 8 months of the year, an alleged sum of 1.3 trillion had been paid out to the marketers. I say alleged here because 1.3 trillion was only one of the figures thrown around. On this particular critical issue, let me quote from the report of an ad hoc committee of the House of Representatives on that oil subsidy scam, and I quote, "Contrary to the earlier official figure of subsidy payment of 1.3 trillion, the Accountant General of the Federation put forward a figure of 1.6 trillion, the Central Bank 1.7 trillion, while our committee established subsidy payment of 2.58 trillion as of December 2011, amounting to more than 900% over the appropriated sum of 245 billion. Let me add a small note of clarification on the particular finding of this House of Representatives ad hoc committee that the sum of 2.5 trillion naira actually paid out was 900% greater than the 2.5 billion naira budgeted. For the year 2011, the budget approved for the whole country was 4.973 trillion, which means that what was paid out to the cabal of oil marketers was more than half of the national budget for the entire country. And to place this within the framework of some of the convertible currencies of the world, 2.58 trillion naira is approximately 16 billion US dollars, 12.46 billion euros, and 10.73 billion British pounds sterling, all paid out to marketers, most of whom were phantom dealers in petroleum products which were never supplied. One more quotation from that same House of ad hoc committee report, and we will move on to my second example of what I am calling the dictatorship of corruption and mediocrity. This is the quotation. Contrary to statutory requirements and other guidelines under the Petroleum Support Fund (PSF) scheme, mandating agencies in the industry to keep reliable information databases, there seemed to be a deliberate understanding among agencies not to do so. This lack of record keeping contributed in no small measure to the decadence and the rot that the committee found in the administration of the PSF. We found out that the subsidy regime has operated under review, that is 2000, in the period under review, was fraught with endemic corruption and entrenched inefficiency. Much of the amount claimed to have been paid as subsidy was actually not for consumed petroleum products. Government officials made nonsense of PSF guidelines due mainly to sleaze and in many cases, incompetence. Decadence, rot, entrenched inefficiency, incompetence. These are the committee's own terms, not mine. Mine is only to draw conclusion from these terms and to make extrapolations from the combined effect of their concatenation in the report's searing indictment of the sublime kind of corruption that reigns in our country. And this is my conclusion, my extrapolation. Corruption is not only dishonesty, fraud, or sleaze, it is also aided by and in turn generates mediocrity, rottenness, and putrefaction. We shall come back to this issue later in the lecture. For now, let us turn our attention to the second of the three exemplary cases that I wish to highlight in this observation and reflections on the challenges that the dictatorship of corruption and mediocrity poses to the Freedom of Information Act. This happened in the year 2006 and entailed a very public feud between no less august and authoritative political personages than the President and the Vice President of the Republic at the time, that is Olusegun Obasanjo and Atiku Abubakar. As with our first case, this case is also well known by the Nigerian public since it was played out in the full glare of public attention, or perhaps we should say public titillations. The feuding in essence entailed accusations and counter-accusations by Obasanjo and Atiku of blatant looting of the Petroleum Technology Development Fund, PTDF, of hundreds of millions of dollars, not naira, hundreds of millions of dollars. It was precipitated when the President sent a report to the National Assembly alleging that Atiku had conspired with some Americans to loot and divert vast sums from the PDF to the benefit of himself and his foreign co-conspirators. Please note that the word loot was in the report that Obasanjo sent to the National Assembly with a demand that impeachment proceedings be launched against the Vice President. Of course, as could be expected, Atiku promptly responded to Obasanjo's charges. But what no one expected, what in fact nearly took everyone's breath away in Atiku's response, was that he did not deny the charges at all. Rather than a denial, he alleged that Obasanjo and some of his cronies and girlfriends had benefited from the funds he had diverted from the PTDF. And to back up this claim, Atiku made photocopies of the checks he had written in favor of these cronies and paramours of Obasanjo. He took out full-page advertorial spreads in major newspapers in which documents in support of this extraordinary counter-accusation were published. Indeed, for several weeks, Nigerian newspapers were filled with lurid details of the looting activities of the President and the Vice President, all put out by the Obasanjo and Atiku camps. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it is tempting to say that this account, this story speaks for itself, but that is not exactly true. To the story itself, and for our purposes in this lecture, we must add that no action based on the FOI, that is the Freedom of Information Act, could ever have brought out the surfeit of information on the looting, the corruption that Obasanjo and Atiku, together with their supporters, voluntarily revealed about themselves. And let us note that nothing happened to Obasanjo, Atiku, and their cronies, girlfriends, and sycophants that benefited from the vast looting of the funds of the PTDF by way of well-deserved punitive action. Indeed, ironically, the only person, the single person who did go to jail was the American Congressman, William J. Jefferson, who at one time was Atiku's point man in the United States Theater of Operations in financial wheeling and dealing, before he and the Vice President quarreled and went their separate ways. But Jefferson served prison time in the United States, not in Nigeria. And he did so only because the FBI got involved in investigating the scandal, and when they raided his Washington, D.C. home, they found $100,000 hidden in the congressman's refrigerator. For our third and final case, we must go all the way back to 1984, when Nigeria was still in the grip of the eruption of military dictatorships into political governance in the country, an eruption whose end seemed at the time to be nowhere in the horizon. The case in point is the Buhari-Idiagbon Decree number 4 of 1984, unquestionably the most notorious of all military decrees ever promulgated in Nigeria. That decree has a special bearing on the subject of this lecture, a bearing that is the exact opposite of what I have said so far concerning the challenge of the Dictatorship of Corruption and Mediocrity to the Freedom of Information Act. For on one level, this is because in military rule, dictatorship manifests itself directly and autocratically. It does not have to manifest itself through corruption. At another level, you simply cannot talk of the Freedom of Information Act in the Nigerian and African dictatorships of the 1970s through the 1990s, when the very first thing that goes with the inception of a military dictatorship is the Constitution itself, together with all the rights that derive from it. Moreover, Nigerian and African military dictatorships are notoriously very paranoid, to the extent that many African military dictators at the time actually went so far as to promulgate decrees banning rumors, as if any human society has ever existed in which there can be no rumor mongering as an inevitable part of social existence. At any rate, the Buhari-Idiagbon Decree number 4 of 1984 took this axiomatic and quixotic paranoia of African military dictatorships to a new level when it explicitly stated that you must not and cannot publish anything to embarrass military leaders and their support civilian officials, even if what you publish is true. It is important to note here that, like the two other cases I have already mentioned in this lecture, this infamous decree against truth also had its origins in the incidence or phenomenon of endemic corruption in our country. This is because the decree came on the heels of allegations of the disappearance of 2.8 billion naira from the coffers of a federal ministry that had been under the headship of Buhari in the previous military administration. Allegedly, Buhari had been deeply embarrassed by those allegations, and when he himself carried out a successful coup, he promulgated Decree number 4 to deal with those sections of the press that had been most probing, most vocal about the alleged missing 2.8 billion naira. From these three cases, we can see that there is a common element, and that common element is corruption. However, unlike the corruption that we saw in both the oil subsidy scam and the Obasanjo and Atiku feud that paraded itself in broad daylight, the alleged corruption in the case of Buhari's military dictatorship was hidden subterranean. Everyone knew it was there, and abundantly so. But you could not talk openly about it. You could not even engage in rumors about it. Moreover, in Buhari's Decree number 4, this veil of silence and secrecy on corruption was made sublime in its impunity and brazenness. For as I have observed, the decree stated without the slightest equivocation that even if you manage to establish beyond all doubt that what you found out about the corruption going on was true, you could not publish it because to do so was to embarrass the military government, its leaders, and its loyal civil servants. This observation leads us to the next stage of this lecture, the stage in which we now directly engage the crucial issue of a dictatorship that is not military, but it is in fact civilian. A dictatorship that in essence is ostensibly not exercised by the gun, but through the complex mediations of corruption and mediocrity of the highest order. To enter into this segment of the lecture, please consider the following ironic reversal of normal expectations concerning dictatorship and democracy. On the one hand, we have a military dictatorship that is non-elective, that is indeed totally contemptuous of popular mandate, but is nonetheless very paranoid about being embarrassed by any revelation that it is corrupt. But on the other hand, we have an elective democratic government that putatively bases its legitimacy on popular mandate, but is completely unembarrassed by any and all allegations of corrupt practices and dealings. Moreover, the democratic dispensation in question is so unashamed about the taint of corruption that in the particular case of the Obasanjo Article 3, it actually broadcasts to the nation and the whole world lurid details of its corruption. I would suggest that the irony in both cases is more apparent than real. Military dictatorships are characteristically very paranoid about being shown to be correct, only because nearly all military coup makers come into power on the claim that they have come to clean up the mess made by civilian governments, or even by a preceding military autocracy. In the case of the Buhari-Idi Agbon dictatorship, that was clearly the most self-righteous, the most fanatical about imposing discipline on Nigeria and Nigerians of all military governments we have ever had. It absolutely could not stand being embarrassed by the taint of corruption, especially if the allegation happened to be based on the truth. The irony in an elective democratic government that brazenly washes the dirty learnings of its oceans of corruption in the national and global public sphere is likewise a factitious irony with no basis in reality. This is because the presumption of virtually all our ruling class parties since the return to formal democratic rule in 1999 is quite simply that no party, no politician ever wins or conversely ever loses an election on the basis of a public exposure of billions and trillions that the politician or the party has looted from oil wealth. At a more general level, winning or losing elections has little or nothing to do with your performance in office. You may be as corrupt and as mediocre as the worst politician on the African continent on the world, but that is no disqualification for you to become a member of the National Assembly, the executive governor of the state, or the president of the republic itself, unless, of course, you have been caught, tried, and jailed. Please understand me. I have not come here this morning to engage in that infamous Nigeria bashing that we encounter in many parts of the world, and that is ironically a national pastime of Nigerians ourselves. And I readily accept the fact that not all our politicians and political parties are corrupt and mediocre. But I do think that the great majority of them are fundamentally predisposed to being corrupt and being mediocre. This is not because... Permit me to expatiate a little on this particular observation. Now, I think it is safe for me to assume that most of us in this gathering this morning would agree to a proposition which states that an endlessly corrupt electoral system in which massive, blatant, and violent rigging of elections plays a central role in the main reason why virtually all our political parties and politicians do not really depend on their performance in office to win elections. Another way of putting this concretely is to say that rather than actually perform well in office and win the respect and the mandate of the people, virtually all our political parties spend most of their time amassing the war chest that will enable them either to successfully rig elections or conversely to prevent successful rigging by opposing political parties and politicians. In other words, rigging does not stand alone. It is part of a vastly corrupt and corrupting political party system. Because this is a very crucial point in this lecture, I wish to be absolutely clear about what I am saying or even claiming here. For this reason, I wish to give one very concrete illustration of my claim here that rigging does not stand alone but is part of a vast network of corruption in our political party system. This illustration, I would argue, is one that most adult and politically sophisticated Nigerians know only too well. Thus, I don't think that anyone here would seriously contest the fact that as the ruling party with a so far ironclad control of the center, the PDP spends most of its time between election cycles preparing to rig itself back into power with absolutely no relevance to how it has performed in office. By contrast, the other ruling class parties not in control at the center but in the seats of power in some of the states of the Federation spend nearly all of their time between electoral cycles amassing the financial means and the strategies with which to prevent the PDP from rigging itself back into power. Nowhere is this whole apparatus of a deeply corrupt and corrupting political order more apparent than in our election tribunals, in which, as everyone knows, political parties and politicians who have more credible claims to having won elections must still bribe very heavily to secure legal redress for having been robbed of their victories through rigging at the polls. It is well known that the 2001 oil subsidy, the impeachment of the president and the vice president. But as I've said, nothing happened to them, and not a single one of their cronies, henchmen, and girlfriends that were beneficiaries of the loot made to pay back a single kobo. I've also said that the 2.58 trillion naira that the House of Representatives ad hoc committee on the oil subsidy mega scam of 2011 declared as the total sum that was looted but guess what? Nobody has paid back a single kobo out of that colossal sum of 2.8 trillion naira that could make the lives of millions of Nigerians better than the horrible conditions they currently have to endure, thanks to this dictatorship of corruption and mediocrity. As a matter of fact, and with regard to this particular case of the oil subsidy scam, the whole nation, perhaps the entire world, was treated to a comedy of errors and absurdity when the chairman of that same House of Rep ad hoc committee, Honorable Farouk Lawan, was caught by a hidden video camera receiving hush money bribe from one of the biggest names among the cabal of real and fake marketers that in collusion with public officers perpetrated the oil subsidy mega scam of 2001. Now, as far as I know, Honorable Lawan has not faced any legislative censure for this egregiously corrupt act, and he has not lost his seniority in the currently sitting membership of the House of Representatives. All that has happened to him is that he is being tried in a court of law in which he is apparently successfully tying up the legal process in a seemingly endless impasse. Since all along this talk, I have been linking corruption and mediocrity in an undeclared dictatorship that, in my opinion, has political governance in our country at the present time in its iron grip. Let me now address this equation between corruption and mediocrity directly, hoping that by doing so, the kind of dictatorship I have in mind here will become much clearer. And I can think of no better way to illustrate this than by saying that corruption and mediocrity in our country at the present time are symbiotic. They feed off of each other. Extremely poor performance or even no performance at all is no barrier to getting very wealthy and holding very high public office in our country, including the highest office in the land. 2.58 trillion naira, that is the equivalent of 12.46 euros and 10.73 pounds sterling looted from the national coffers for petroleum products, the bulk of which were not supplied at all by many phantom, non-existent oil marketers. But behind it all, and according to the House of Representatives Ad Hoc Committee on the Oil Subsidy Scam, we see, and I quote, a gross lack of record keeping, decadence, rot, and entrenched inefficiency of the public officials that supervise the payment of those vast sums to the oil marketers. These epithets of abysmally low standards of performance and probity were addressed to the specific case of the oil subsidy scam, but as every adult thinking Nigerian knows, they might as well have been addressed to the generation and distribution of electricity, construction of physical infrastructures like roads, bridges, hospitals, and schools, public sanitation and waste disposal, social services for young people, the elderly, and the disabled. Federal and state governments don't have to perform well or perform at all to generate the funds on which they depend. It comes to them like manna from heaven, even though we know that the source is the rent from the oil fields of the Niger Delta. Being wealthy, very, very wealthy in many cases in our country, has little or nothing to do with value-added production, but has everything to do with where one is located in the sharing of the rents from the oil wealth bonanza through contracts, handouts, and simple, straightforward loot. Particularly at the center of things at the level of the federal government, of the federation, and the ruling party, the standards of performance in virtually all areas of governance are so low that almost any other party or phalanx of politicians can credibly claim that they can do better than the current incumbents, even though there is little to choose between the ruling class parties in terms of their ideologies and their value orientation. Almost everywhere that we find corruption in our country, mediocrity is never too far behind. At this point, and drawing upon my professional academic interest in linguistic, literary, and cultural studies, I would like to offer some thoughts on the separate and yet connected relations between the cognate terms corrupt, corruptive, and corrupted. My intention in doing this is both to further clarify and broaden the ramifications of this link that I am urging between corruption and mediocrity in our country. Thus, when we say that a person, an act, or a process is corrupt, we are alluding adjectively to a quality, a disposition, or an effect. The term corruptive, on the other hand, lends a dimension that old school or traditionalist teachers of language like to describe as more active, more dynamic. In other words, the term corruptive implies an active transformation that turns that which is not initially corrupt to that which becomes tainted with corruption. The term corrupted lends an even more dynamic, more perfected or completed dimension to the term corruptive, which is why it is at this level that the term corruption that we use so often to describe our politicians and their habitual practices takes on the quality of a spectre, a malaise, a generalized social pathology to terms with a very urgent, perhaps even desperate link between corruption and mediocrity that I am arguing here. We tend to associate corruption primarily with our electoral process and our politicians and political parties. But who among us is unaware of the cheap, superstitious, and facile religiosity that underlies the grip of Naira and the amassing of great wealth in our mega churches and among our most prominent jet-setting religious leaders? Who is unaware of the scale of examination malpractices in our primary and secondary educational institutions and the abysmal quality of instruction and preparation that our undergraduates receive in our universities, polytechnics, and colleges of education? Yes, the corruption has its roots, its foundations in the political order and among our rulers, but almost every institution in our country has become corrupted. Since I am an academic and was once anyway the national president of the Academic Staff Union of Universities, that is ASU, I am particularly interested in the decay, the unspeakable fall in standards that has befallen our educational institutions. Since I have written extensively on this issue, I will give only a few particularly shocking examples of this terribly corrupted state of things in our primary, secondary, and tertiary institutions. Thus, the failure rates in our secondary school leaving examinations are some of the worst in the world. In the last 1 decade, I don't think we have recorded anything higher than 35% of passes in this examination. In one particular year, in the NECO exams, only 1.8% of those who sat for the exams passed, leaving a staggering failure rate of 98.2%. Our universities are poorly ranked in the world, but not a single one of them is among the 2,000 most highly rated institutions. But even far more alarming is the fact that that our universities are also poorly ranked among African universities. In the most recently released rankings, only 8 out of our universities were listed among the first 100 universities in Africa. And no Nigerian institution is among the first 20. And within the country itself, in the business sector of the economy, potential employers of our university graduates are forever complaining that the instruction in our university, instruction our university students receive are so appallingly poor that a lot of the graduates are simply unemployable. The list goes on and on with a depressing regularity that has a grim foreboding for the future of our country. I do not wish to empty out the contents of the special focus of the theme of this lecture, the Freedom of Information Act of 2001 in relation to the dictatorship of corruption, into an endless jeremiad about the things that are prematurely corrupted in virtually all the institutions of our society. The Greeks have a saying that is very pertinent here that I wish to invoke to underscore this point. And this is the saying: when a fish begins to rot, the process starts from the head, and it's from there that the decay pervades the entire body of the fish. From this, I wish to state with as much emphasis as I can muster that it is our rulers, our politicians and political parties that we must hold accountable if we wish to arrest the rot, the decay that acts like a dictatorship in our present political order. One aspect of a comprehensive transnational view of corruption that we would do well to keep in mind in this respect is the fact that as much as it is a phenomenon that most countries of the world have to contend with, corruption is not always or even necessarily linked with mediocrity as we find it with our rulers. As a matter of fact, as big as corruption is in Nigeria, it is nothing in size compared with the corruption that has been documented and much discussed with regard to some of the biggest transnational business conglomerates of Western and East Asian countries. Without in the least bit offering an apologia for the scope of corruption among our rulers, I would insist that it ought to be pointed out that Transparency International is able to regularly rank corruption higher in African and other developing nations of the world than what obtains in the West, only because its figures pertain only to the countries and regions of the world, leaving out the big business empires of the planet, who, between them, account for by far the greatest share of corruption in the world, together with the effects that corruption has on the lives of the poorest and the most vulnerable people of our planet. And so I repeat, corruption is not always and necessarily linked with mediocrity, with abysmally low or poor standards. The high incidence of corruption in the ranks of some of the smartest and most innovative corporations in other forms and shares of democracy. If I wanted to invoke the theoretical jargon of radical political economy, I would say that our Freedom of Information Act of 2011 presupposes that our country is on the verge of transforming primitive accumulation of the most vicious kind, since it is based on surplus accumulation from an offshore extractive industry, and not, as in the historic models on agrarian capitalism, that our country is on the verge of transforming primitive accumulation into a modern, market-driven economy in which, in conjunction with cutthroat competition, you have the supremacy of the law. But it is doubtful that our press and media houses have thought much of these ramifications of the Freedom of the Information Act. This is because as much as they fought long and hard for the passing of this act, they have been remarkably reticent in using it to compel our rulers, our public institutions, and private business companies to comply with the provisions of the act. Now let me move to the concluding section of this talk by briefly engaging one of the few instances when the provisions of the Act have been invoked and has met stiff, unyielding resistance from the powers that be in our country. Permit me to go carefully over the story. Now, this much is known about the scale of remuneration of the members of our National Assembly. Both in relative and absolute terms, they are the highest paid legislators in the world. For instance, we do know that each of the members of our House of Representatives and the Senate collects far more in salaries, allowances, and bonuses than the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world. In the face of the universal outcry in the country against the whopping scale of our legislators' remuneration package, they have been extremely secretive about the precise figures. Indeed, the length to which they are apparently willing to go to keep these exact figures hidden from public awareness and scrutiny seems to have no bounds. Thus, when a former member of the House, Honorable Dino Melaye, began to go public with these figures, he was swiftly and severely dealt with by the leadership of the House. Indeed, the manner in which he was silenced was so effective that no other member of the National Assembly has since then ever dared to present company except. As outrageous at what was done to silence Mr. Melaye and then to use him as a negative example of potential whistleblowers, it pales into relative insignificance in comparison with how the National Assembly responded when the civil society organization, the Legal Assistance and Aid Project, LEPAD, invoked the Freedom of Information Act of 2011 to compel our legislators to reveal to the Nigerian people exactly how much they are paid. They refused absolutely. Consequent on this refusal, LEPAD dragged the National Assembly to the courts. In a suit argued by the frontline activist lawyer, Femi Falana, SAN, the High Court ordered the National Assembly to act in accordance with a law that it had itself passed by promptly releasing the full details of the salaries and emoluments to members of the Assembly. They still refused and then took the matter to federal court. The case is still pending in court. I should mention that without being a lone figure crying in the wilderness, Femi Falana has done much to put the usefulness, the value of the Freedom of Information Act to test again and again since 2011, when the Act was enacted. He has invoked the Act in relation to a range of issues of public good that pertain to a whole group of governmental functionaries, parastatals, private commercial interests, including but not limited to the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of the Federation, the Universal Basic Education UBE Commission, the National Drug Law Enforcement Agency, NDLEA, and the GSM Internet Providers. I do not think that Falana harbors any illusion at all that by itself, the Freedom of Information Act will radically and positively transform the present endlessly corrupt and mediocre Nigerian political order. But he is taking this prevailing and deeply unjust, wasteful, and corrupted order to the very limits of its claim to being a democracy founded on the rule of law, and not a failing state perpetually on the brink of becoming a failed state. Let Falana's example be a wake-up call to our media houses and our journalists that they must rediscover the reasons why they fought long and hard for this act to be passed. I end with the words of a song by Oshuba that I find very reflective on the desperate optimism that has driven much of what I've been saying in this lecture. Nigeria go better, Nigeria go good, oh. Nigeria go better. Nigeria go good. I thank you.